She's too poor for a prince. The words echoed louder in her mind than in the room, but she kept walking, each step heavier than the last, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. At the altar, the prince stood tall, his face void of emotion. No smile, no warmth, just a cold, distant stare. She reached him, her eyes searching his for a flicker of the man who once promised forever. Nothing. The officiant's voice broke the silence. "Do you, your highness, take this woman to be your wife?" A pause, a long painful pause, then without looking at her he spoke, his words sharp, final. "I cannot marry someone beneath my status." Her world didn't shatter with a crash, it shattered with silence. The officiant's voice cut through the heavy silence. "Do you, your highness, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The prince didn't respond. A beat passed, then another. The room grew tense, filled with quiet anticipation. All eyes were on him, but he wasn't looking at her. Instead, his gaze shifted to his father, stoic, unblinking, seated among the royal dignitaries, his expectations carved into every line on his face. The prince's jaw clenched. His fingers curled slightly at his sides. Then he turned back to her. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw a flicker of something. Doubt? Regret? But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something cold, distant. His voice came out sharp, cutting through the silence like glass shattering on stone. "I cannot marry someone beneath my status." The words hung in the air, heavier than the golden chandeliers above. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, like a wave crashing against the shore. Whispers erupted, filled with shock, pity, and disbelief. But she didn't hear any of it. Her world had gone quiet. Her smile faded, her lips parting slightly, not to speak but because she couldn't find the breath to form words. Her heart, once racing with hope, now felt like it had been dropped from the highest tower, shattered before it even hit the ground. She stared at him, searching for something, anything to prove this was a mistake, a misunderstanding, a cruel joke. But his face told her the truth. It wasn't. This was real, and she was nothing to him. The prince's words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and irreversible. "I cannot marry someone beneath my status." A gasp rippled through the grand hall, followed by an eruption of whispers, like a wildfire spreading in all directions. Some voices were dripping with pity, others thick with mockery. "Did you hear that? He refused her right at the altar." She actually thought she could be a princess? How embarrassing. Look at her standing there like a fool. The bride's world blurred. The opulence of the hall, the golden chandeliers, the sea of faces, it all faded. The only sound she could hear was the deafening echo of her shattered heart. Her family sat in the front row, heads bowed low, their shame heavier than the royal expectations that had crushed her spirit. Her father, once proud, now looked at the floor, unable to meet his daughter's eyes. Her mother clutched her hands tightly in her lap, trembling, silent, as if words could only add to the humiliation. They were powerless, because against the weight of royalty, their voices meant nothing. She stood motionless, her heart pleading for this to be a nightmare she'd wake from. But reality was far more brutal. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. But she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of those who waited to feast on her pain. With trembling fingers, she reached up and unclipped her delicate veil, the symbol of a future that no longer existed. She stared at it for a brief moment, remembering the dreams it represented. Then, with a deep, shaky breath, she placed it gently on the ground. Not thrown, not dropped, placed. Because even in heartbreak, she held on to her dignity. The hall fell eerily silent as she turned, her steps slow but steady. She didn't look back, not at the prince, not at her family, not at the faces twisted with judgment and false sympathy. Every step she took was a declaration. "You broke me, but you will not define me." She walked away, not just from the altar, but from the life she had been promised, the love she had believed in, and the people who thought her worth could be measured by wealth. And though her heart was in pieces, Her back remained straight, her head held high, because while he had rejected her as a bride, she would rise as something far greater. The palace doors slammed shut behind her, sealing off the life she had once dreamed of. The grand hall, the whispers, the coldness in the prince's eyes, all left behind, yet their echoes clung to her like shadows. She stood on the palace steps, the weight of the world pressing down on her fragile heart. No carriage waited, no family reached out. She was alone, wrapped in the remnants of a gown that now felt like a costume from a life that wasn't hers. Where would she go? She didn't know, but standing still wasn't an option. Her feet carried her through the crowded streets where the whispers followed like ghosts. People stared, their eyes sharp with recognition. Isn't that the girl the prince rejected? She thought she could marry royalty? What a joke! She deserved it. Knowing her place would have saved her the embarrassment. She kept her head down, her heart screaming louder than the voices. But she didn't cry. Not here, not now. Days blurred into nights. The elegant shoes she once wore grew tattered, her delicate dress stained by dust and desperation. She knocked on doors, one after another, asking for work. Any work. But every time, the answer was the same, a dismissive glance, a pitying smile, and a door slammed shut. We don't hire people with your reputation. You're not fit for this. Isn't there somewhere else you should be? Rejection after rejection. Hunger gnawed at her, not just in her stomach, but in her soul. Cold nights curled her against walls, her arms wrapped around herself because no one else would. Loneliness crept in like frost, chilling every memory of the girl she used to be. But even in the darkest corners of her despair, a small flame burned. A stubborn ember deep inside her heart whispered, "This isn't the end." She refused to be defined by that one moment in the palace, by the prince's rejection, by society's judgment. Her heart was broken, her body was weak, her future was uncertain, but her spirit, unshaken. She stood up, again and again, dusting herself off after every fall, because while the world had turned its back on her, she refused to turn her back on herself. This was her harsh reality. But it wasn't her final chapter. The days blended into nights, and the sharp sting of humiliation faded into something even more persistent, survival. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but it was the ache in her heart that burned the deepest. She had been cast aside, stripped of dignity, left with nothing but the fragile threads of a shattered dream. But where most would crumble, she felt something else growing. A small, stubborn spark buried beneath the weight of rejection. She refused to be remembered as the girl who was left at the altar. She would write a new story. With no place to call home, she took shelter wherever she could, beneath crumbling rooftops, in dark alleys, on cold stone steps. Each morning she woke up with the same emptiness, but she carried it like armor, turning her heartbreak into fuel. She knocked on doors, not for sympathy, but for opportunity. No job was beneath her. She cleaned dusty shop floors, hauled crates at bustling markets, and even swept the corners of small, failing businesses. While her hands grew calloused and her clothes worn thin, her mind remained sharp, observing, absorbing, learning. She noticed things others overlooked. How one merchant attracted more customers with simple words. How a baker's stall flourished not just because of fresh bread, but because of how it was presented. She watched transactions, listened to negotiations, memorized patterns. Every small job became a lesson. She saved every coin, tucking them away with the care of someone who knew what it was like to have nothing. Even when hunger roared louder than ambition, she chose to invest in herself, buying old, tattered books from street vendors, learning about business, leadership, and strategy under flickering candlelight. Failure was her constant companion. Her first attempt to start a small venture selling handmade fabrics ended in disaster. No one trusted her. She wasn't the noble bride-to-be anymore, just a girl with calloused hands and tired eyes. She faced insults, rejections, even theft, but she didn't stop. Each setback was a lesson, every mistake a blueprint for what not to do. Her pain had transformed into resilience. With time, her small savings grew. She started a modest shop in a forgotten corner of the city. It wasn't glamorous, a tiny space with creaky floors and faded walls, but it was hers. She poured her heart into it, treating every customer like royalty, not because they deserved it, but because she did. Word spread. People whispered, not about the girl who had been left behind, but about the woman who had built something from nothing. Her business grew, so did she. Her face no longer carried the fragile hope of a bride waiting for acceptance. Instead, it held the quiet strength of a woman who had carved her own path through the rubble of her past. She was no longer defined by the man who had rejected her. She had discovered something far more powerful than a prince's love, her own worth. The prince sat upon his grand throne, its golden edges gleaming under the soft glow of the chandeliers. His crown rested perfectly atop his head, and yet it felt heavier than ever. The echoes of admiration that once filled the palace halls had faded, replaced by whispers of discontent, murmurs of betrayal, and the cold shadow of doubt. He didn't see it at first, the cracks forming beneath the surface. Pride had blinded him. In his mind, he was untouchable, a ruler born to command, a man whose decisions needed no justification. But the empire he thought was carved in stone was built on fragile ground, held together not by loyalty, but by fear, power, and temporary alliances. The signs were all there. Trade deals once sealed with eager handshakes were now met with hesitation. Foreign dignitaries, who used to shower him with gifts and flattery, sent cold letters filled with veiled threats. The kingdom's treasury, once overflowing with wealth, began to run dry as investments crumbled and debts piled high. But the prince dismissed them all. "They are jealous of my power," he told himself. "They fear me. That's why they keep their distance." Little did he know it wasn't fear that kept them away. It was disbelief. His arrogance had driven away the very people who once stood by his side. Trusted advisors, men he believed to be loyal, whispered behind closed doors, plotting their own rise to power. Allies turned into opportunists, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One by one, his empire began to crumble. A failed military campaign left his borders vulnerable. A trusted general defected, taking half the army with him. A scandal erupted within the royal court, exposing corruption tied to his name. But even as his world collapsed, the prince remained defiant. They will come back. They always do. But they didn't. Day after day, he sat on his throne, surrounded by silence where there had once been applause. His castle, once filled with the laughter of nobles and the buzz of admiration, grew colder, emptier. For the first time, he felt it. Loneliness. Not the loneliness of an empty room, but the crushing weight of realizing that no one cared. Not his advisors, not his allies, not even the people he ruled. And as he stared into the vast emptiness of his grand hall, a thought crept into his mind, one he had buried long ago. What if I was wrong? But by the time he asked the question, it was already too late. His kingdom was falling, and so was he. The once grand palace stood silent, its marble halls echoing with nothing but emptiness. The vibrant colors of royalty had faded into shadows of what used to be, just like the man who ruled it. The prince sat alone on his towering throne, but there was no audience left to witness his fall, no advisors to flatter him, no crowds to cheer his name, just the vast, cold emptiness of a kingdom built on pride, now crumbling around him. He stared at the golden ring in his hand, not a symbol of love, but of a decision that had defined his downfall, the same ring he was supposed to place on her finger. The woman he left behind. Her face haunted him, more vivid than the riches that once surrounded him. He remembered her smile, not the forced, polished smiles of royal guests, but a real one, genuine, pure, untainted by status or power. She loved him for who he was, not for the crown he wore, but he had thrown it all away. "She's beneath my status," he had declared with arrogance, thinking he was too important to be with someone so simple, so ordinary. Now, she was the one standing tall in the world, while he sat alone, drowning in his regret. His mind replayed every moment, the warmth in her eyes, the softness in her voice, The way she had looked at him like he was enough without the crown, something no one had ever done before or since. What if I hadn't walked away, he wondered. What if I had chosen her instead of chasing power? But regret is a heavy burden, especially when it comes too late. The walls of the palace felt like they were closing in, suffocating him with memories of what could have been. He could still hear the echoes of her footsteps as she walked away from him that day, her dignity intact while he stood there, thinking he had won. But he hadn't. She was the one who had truly won. She had found herself, her purpose, her power, without him. And all he had left was the crushing realization that he had lost the only thing that ever truly mattered. Not the kingdom, not the wealth, not the crown, her. But the past cannot be rewritten. And now he was nothing more than a king without a queen, an empire without a soul. The grand hall buzzed with chatter, adorned with dazzling lights, golden arches, and the finest decor royalty could afford. World leaders, dignitaries, and nobles from every corner of the globe filled the space, dressed in the most extravagant attire, their conversations a mix of power, politics, and prestige. The prince stood near the center, his once commanding presence now a fragile shadow of its former self. His crown sat heavier on his head, not with pride, but with the weight of loss. He sipped his glass absent-mindedly, his gaze distant, until the room fell into a sudden, unexpected hush. Something, or rather someone, had shifted the atmosphere. The grand doors opened, and there she was. She entered not with hesitation, but with confidence, her steps measured, her posture regal. The soft glow from the chandeliers above reflected off her stunning gown, crafted not to impress, but to announce. She belonged here. His heart raced, gripped by something unfamiliar. Not arrogance, not entitlement, but a suffocating mix of disbelief and regret. It was her, but she wasn't the woman he had left behind. Gone was the fragile bride, the girl he had dismissed as beneath his status. In her place stood a queen in her own right, not defined by wealth or title, but by something far greater, her resilience, her strength, her undeniable power. She was surrounded by influential leaders, diplomats, and respected figures, not trailing behind them, but walking beside them, as an equal. Heads turned not because of who she was with, but because of who she had become. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. He felt his breath catch. There was no anger in her gaze, no bitterness, no sadness, just indifference. That was the hardest part. Not the fact that she had risen without him, but that she had done so in a way where he no longer mattered. She smiled politely at someone beside her, a genuine smile, one he realized she used to reserve just for him. The realization hit him harder than any crown could weigh. She was no longer the woman he had rejected. She was a queen, and he was just the man who let her go. The prince's heart raced as he stood frozen, watching her command the room with effortless grace. Every movement she made was deliberate, every glance exuding power. People gravitated toward her, not because of her beauty, though she was radiant, but because of the aura she carried. Confidence, authority, a queen in every sense of the word. He clenched his glass tighter, feeling the weight of his choices crush down on him. The laughter of dignitaries faded into the background, drowned out by the pounding regret in his chest. How had he not seen this in her before? His feet moved before his pride could stop them, weaving through the crowd until he stood just a breath away from her. His voice, once full of arrogance and control, felt fragile as he called out softly, "It's been a long time." She turned slowly, her eyes landing on him with the cool precision of someone who remembered the past, but no longer lived in it. There was no anger, no flicker of the hurt he expected, only calm indifference, the kind that stings more than fury ever could. The prince swallowed hard, searching for traces of the girl he had once left behind. But she wasn't there. Gone was the fragile woman who had wept beneath palace lights. In her place stood someone who had built herself from the ruins he left her in. She didn't need him. She never had. He forced a smile, hoping to find familiarity in her gaze. "You look different." She tilted her head slightly, studying him, not with admiration, but with distant curiosity, as if he were nothing more than a forgotten chapter in her story. Then she spoke, her voice steady, laced with both grace and steel. "You left me because I was nothing," she said, her eyes locking onto his with piercing clarity. "Now, I am everything without you." The words hit harder than any rejection he'd ever known. She turned away, effortlessly returning to the crowd that now adored her, leaving him standing there, not as a prince, not as a man of power, just a man drowning in the shadow of his own regret. And for the first time in his life, he realized what true loss felt like. Not the loss of wealth, not the loss of status, but the loss of someone who had been priceless all along. The prince stood alone in the grand hall, his heart pounding against the walls of his chest, like a drum echoing in an empty room. The laughter and chatter from the crowd blurred into distant noise. His gaze remained fixed on her, the woman he had once cast aside with words sharper than any sword. Now she stood at the center of attention, surrounded by powerful people, her presence commanding respect without uttering a single word. How had he been so blind? His feet felt like they were weighed down with stones. But regret pushed him forward, step after step, until he found himself standing just a few breaths away from her. She didn't notice him at first, too busy engaging with dignitaries and leaders who hung on her every word. The woman he had left behind was long gone. This was someone new, someone untouchable. Gathering what little courage he had left, he softly spoke. "Can we talk?" She turned, her gaze meeting his, without a flicker of surprise. No warmth, no anger. Just a calm, steady look that pierced through him more painfully than any accusation could. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. It was as if seeing him was no more significant than the air she breathed. They stepped aside, away from the crowd, though he felt as though the whole world was watching. For a moment, he couldn't find his words. The man who had spoken with confidence before kings now stood speechless before the woman he'd once called unworthy. He took a shaky breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong." She said nothing, her expression unchanging, but the silence demanded more. His chest tightened, the words clawing their way out. I thought I was above you," he continued, his voice trembling. "I thought my title, my status, my power meant something. But none of it matters. Not when I lost the only person who ever saw me for more than all of that." Still she remained quiet, her face a mask of grace, her posture relaxed, as if his apology was just another sound in the room. "I hurt you," he admitted, his eyes dropping to the floor, ashamed. "I destroyed something beautiful because I was too blind, too arrogant to see your worth. I've thought about you every day since. I see your face when I close my eyes. I hear your voice in the silence. And every time, it reminds me of the man I could have been if I hadn't let you go." A pause hung between them, thick with regret. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but powerful, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "You didn't break me," she said, her eyes unwavering. "You broke yourself. You thought you left me behind, but it was you who got left behind. You thought you took away my worth, but all you did was give me the space to find it on my own." Her words hit harder than any slap could have. They carved into him, leaving wounds far deeper than he expected. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, his voice hollow. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know. I see it now. I see who you are, and I see who I could have been if I hadn't been such a fool." She studied him for a moment, her eyes softening, but not with sympathy. It was something else, pity maybe, but not for herself, for him. "I don't hate you," she said quietly. "I don't even think about you anymore, and that's what hurts you the most, isn't it? That I moved on, that you're just a chapter I've already finished reading." The finality of her words settled over him like cold ash. She gave him a small nod, then turned to leave, her steps light, her posture strong, unburdened, and he remained standing there, drowning in the emptiness she left behind. For the first time, he truly understood. It wasn't her forgiveness he needed, it was his own. The prince stood motionless, the echoes of his own apology still ringing in his ears. His heart pounded, not from hope, but from the crushing weight of an answer he knew was coming, an answer that would bury the last fragile piece of his pride. She faced him, her gaze steady, unwavering. There was no anger in her eyes, no trace of the heartbreak he'd once caused. That was the part that hurt the most. She wasn't haunted by the past, not like he was. She had let it go, and in doing so, she had let him go too. Her voice was soft, yet it carved through him like a blade. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said, her words floating in the space between them like distant echoes. "But not for you, for me." His breath caught. She continued, her expression calm, as if she was simply stating a fact, not shattering the last remnants of his hope. "I needed to be free of the anger, the pain, the weight of what you did. Holding on to it would have chained me to a past that doesn't deserve my present." She paused, her gaze drifting over him, not with bitterness, but with indifference. He had become a distant memory, an old scar that no longer ached. "You were part of my story," she said, her voice steady. "But not my destiny." Those words hit him harder than her rejection ever could. They weren't just words. They were a verdict, a door slamming shut with no hope of being reopened. His chest tightened. "But I still—" he started, desperation slipping into his voice. She raised her hand slightly, not in anger, but as a gentle barrier. "Don't," she whispered softly. "Don't ruin what little dignity you have left." She turned then, her steps light, her back straight, walking away with the same grace she had carried when she walked down the aisle all those years ago. Except this time, she wasn't walking toward him. She was walking away. He stood there, rooted in place, drowning in the emptiness of what could have been. The grand hall that once made him feel powerful now felt like a prison. Each step she took echoed in his mind, a painful reminder that the door he once slammed shut was now closed to him forever. And for the first time in his life, the prince realized, you can apologize for the past, but you can't undo it. The grand palace, once a symbol of unmatched power and prestige, now stood as a hollow monument to the prince's mistakes. The echo of his footsteps filled the empty marble halls, each step a reminder of the people who once surrounded him, advisors who flattered, friends who praised, and courtiers who bowed. But they were gone now, scattered like leaves in the wind when the storm had passed. He found himself in the vast throne room, the golden seat gleaming under the dim glow of the chandeliers. It had always been his symbol of authority, of absolute control. Now it was just an ornate chair, cold, lifeless, meaningless. He sat down slowly, his reflection staring back at him from the polished floor beneath his feet. For years, he believed that this, the crown on his head, the wealth at his fingertips, the power he wielded, defined his worth. He thought love was a weakness, something fragile that couldn't stand against the strength of a kingdom. But now, as he sat alone with nothing but his thoughts, he realized the cruel irony. It wasn't love that was fragile, it was him. Memories flooded his mind like an unrelenting tide. Her laughter in the quiet corners of the palace gardens, the softness in her eyes when she looked at him, not the prince, not the heir to the throne, just him. She had loved him before the crown, before the expectations, and he had cast her aside like she was nothing, chasing the illusion that power would be enough. But power couldn't fill the empty space in his heart. It couldn't quiet the deafening silence of his empty halls. It couldn't hold him when regret kept him awake at night. He stared at his hands, once the hands of a ruler, now just the hands of a man who had lost the only person who truly mattered. The realization settled over him like a heavy cloak. All the wealth, all the status, all the kingdoms in the world couldn't buy back what he had thrown away. He thought of her now, not with the arrogance of a prince recalling someone he once knew, but with the heartbreak of a man mourning a love he had never deserved. She had become everything without him, and he had become nothing despite everything. For the first time he understood. His crown was just metal, His throne was just wood. His palace was just stone. She was the treasure he never saw. And now she was gone. He sat there, lost in his reflection, not as a prince, not as a ruler, but as a man staring at the emptiness of his own heart. The years passed, but her light never dimmed. In fact, it grew brighter, casting a glow far beyond the walls of any palace. She wasn't remembered as the woman left at the altar. She was remembered as the woman who rose from it. Her name echoed in corridors of power, not as an afterthought tied to a prince, but as a force in her own right. She built empires with the same hands that once trembled in heartbreak. She crafted her legacy with the same heart that had been shattered and rebuilt, stronger with every piece. People spoke of her resilience, her strength, her wisdom. Leaders sought her counsel, nations respected her decisions, and generations admired her story. She wasn't defined by a title given to her. She had become her own crown. She stood tall, not because someone lifted her up, but because she refused to stay down. Her success wasn't born from revenge. It was born from the simple, undeniable truth that she never needed validation from anyone who couldn't see her worth. She walked through grand halls and across nations, her presence commanding respect without demanding it. She didn't need to speak of her past. It was written in her poise, in her confidence, in the life she had built. And somewhere, in a distant palace now filled with silence, the prince watched. Not with the pride of someone who once knew her, but with the regret of someone who had lost the chance to stand beside her. But her story was never about him. It was always about her. Because your worth isn't defined by who walks away from you. It's defined by how you rise after they do. She didn't just rise, she soared. And the world remembered her not as the woman who was left behind, but as the queen who never needed to be chosen to be royal. If this story touched your heart and inspired you, don't forget to like this video to show your support. Comment below. What was the most powerful moment for you? Have you ever faced a situation where you had to rise after being left behind? Subscribe to our channel for more emotionally gripping and inspiring stories that remind us of the strength we carry within. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that their worth isn't defined by others. It's defined by how they choose to rise. Your story matters. Love.